At my father's retirement party, my sister grabbed the microphone to call me a selfish traitor who abandoned the family, never knowing I had secretly saved our parents from losing everything. The banquet hall smelled like sheet cake and cheap champagne when my sister ripped the microphone out of my hand. I'd barely started my toast. 2 sentences in, maybe 3. The Elks Lodge on Route 9 had strung up a banner that read, "Congratulations, Frank, 31 years. The letter slightly crooked because Roy had hung it himself on a stepladder that morning. Foil balloons shaped like retirement watches bobbed against the ceiling tiles. Someone had set up a slideshow on a laptop connected to a projector. My father's whole working life scrolling past in silence behind us. A young man in a hard hat next to a young man with a mustache. Then a middle-aged man at a company picnic. Then gray hair. Then nothing. Because the slideshow always stopped a few years before the present. Like nobody wanted to admit how much time had actually passed. I'd flown in from Seattle that morning, changed in an airport bathroom, and driven straight from the Mansfield airport to the lodge with my toast written on an index card in my purse. I'd practiced it twice in the rental car. I made it through the opening line, something about my father teaching me to check the oil in a car before he ever taught me to drive one. And I was reaching for the second line when Paige stood up from her table near the front. "Here's to the prodigal daughter," Paige said, her voice booming through the speakers Dad's co-workers had rented for the night, the microphone already out of my hand before I fully registered she'd taken it. Flying off to Seattle to play tech mogul while the rest of us held this family together, 70 people laughed. Some of them were strangers to me, men in Kesler Steel windbreakers who'd worked the line with my father for 31 years, women I only half recognized from church potlucks a decade gone. Some of them were cousins I hadn't seen since Easter. My mother laughed the loudest of anyone in the room, one hand pressed flat against her chest like she was trying to keep the sound from escaping too fast. My father stared down at his shoes, his dress shoes, the ones he only wore to weddings and funerals, and, apparently, his own retirement. His neck had gone the color of a brick. I didn't cry. I didn't grab the mic back or raise my voice. I just stood there in my navy dress with my hand still curled around a water glass, letting the laughter roll over me in one long wave, because I knew something none of them did. 19 months earlier, my mother had called me at 2 in the morning, crying so hard I could barely make out the words. My father had been scammed out of his entire retirement. He'd taken a loan against the house to chase a fake investment, and the man he'd trusted with it had vanished with the money. They were 2 weeks from foreclosure. My father had started talking quietly about driving his truck into the ravine off County Road 9, just to let the insurance cover what he couldn't. I told my mother I would fix it. I told her no one could ever know, not even Paige. I hired a lawyer, opened a private holding company under a name that meant nothing to anyone in Harrow Falls, and bought the debt outright from the man who held it. I wired $315,000 from my own account to make the whole thing disappear, then had the paperwork dressed up to look like a hardship settlement so my father wouldn't have to feel like a charity case in his own home. So when Paige stood at that podium calling me selfish, I reached into my clutch and pulled out my phone. "Keep the mic, Paige," I said, and my voice cut clean through the room. "I just need Dad to check his email for a second." He blinked at me, confused, and put on the reading glasses he kept clipped to his shirt pocket. I watched his eyes move across the screen, the wire confirmation, my name on the sender line, $315,000 dated 19 months back, routed straight from my personal account into the account that had been 2 weeks from losing his house. Behind him, on the folding table by the gift bags, a sheet cake with his name written in blue icing sat half-cut, a knife still resting in it. The patio went dead silent. Someone near the back dropped a plastic fork, and the small clatter of it against the concrete seemed to echo for a full second before anyone breathed again. My father's hand started shaking around the phone. "She didn't abandon us," he said, so quiet I almost didn't catch it, staring at me instead of the screen. "She saved us. It was her the whole time." Paige's face drained white. "That's fake," she said, gripping the microphone stand with both hands. "She's making it up to ruin my toast." My father didn't even look at her. He set his glasses down on the gift table, walked the length of that patio in front of every single guest, and put his arms around me, sobbing into my shoulder like something in him had finally been allowed to break. To understand why I let it get that far before I ended it, you have to go back further than 19 months. You have to go back almost to the beginning. I am 34 years old. I grew up in Harrow Falls, Ohio, in a 3-bedroom house on Larkin Street that my father bought the year I was born, back when Kesler Steel Works still ran 3 full shifts and the town still had a movie theater downtown. By the time I was in high school, the theater had closed and reopened as a vape shop, then closed again. That was Harrow Falls in a sentence. It didn't die all at once. It just quietly lost pieces of itself, year after year, until the people who stayed learned to stop noticing what was missing. My father, Frank Sutherland, worked the mill floor for 31 years, most of them as a line supervisor. He was the kind of man who fixed things without being asked, who could tell you the make and model of any car that passed the house just by the sound of its engine, who never once in my childhood raised his voice at me, except for the single time I'll get to. My mother, Carol, was the school secretary at Harrow Falls Elementary for almost as long, the woman who kept a drawer of granola bars for kids whose parents forgot to feed them breakfast, who knew every teacher's coffee order and every student's home situation without ever writing any of it down. They were not wealthy people. They were the kind of steady, careful people who paid their bills on the first of the month and put $20 a week into a coffee can labeled vacation that mostly funded trips to a rented cabin in Amish country. Paige is 3 years older than me. Growing up, she was the one who braided my hair before school and let me sleep in her room during thunderstorms, the one who taught me to ride a bike in the church parking lot on Sundays because it was the only flat pavement in town without traffic. We were close. In the uncomplicated way sisters are close before the world starts asking them to compete for the same finite amount of parental attention. That started to change around the time we became adults and made different choices with our lives. Paige stayed in Harrow Falls. She did 2 years at the community college in Mansfield studying early childhood education before dropping out to work the front desk at the same dermatology office my mother eventually became a patient of, and married her high school boyfriend Todd Callahan at 23 in a wedding at the same Elks Lodge where, 14 years later, she would grab a microphone out of my hand. Todd worked in HVAC installation, steady hours, decent money, the kind of practical trade that kept Harrow Falls running, even as everything glossier around it shut down. They had my niece Ivy a year into the marriage, followed by my nephew Sam 3 years after that. Paige built her entire identity around proximity. She was the daughter who showed up to every Sunday dinner, who drove mom to her dermatology appointments, who sat in the hospital waiting room the time dad's appendix ruptured while I was stuck on a red-eye somewhere over Montana. She was physically present in a way I stopped being the day I left for Ohio State at 18, and for a long time, I understood why that mattered to her, why she needed it counted as its own kind of currency, even if I couldn't have named it that clearly back then. I left because Harrow Falls never felt like a place I fit, and because I was good at something the town had no real use for. I majored in accounting at Ohio State, took a forensic accounting job at a mid-sized firm in Cleveland called Whitfield and Voss straight out of school, and spent 6 years tracing fraudulent invoices and shell transactions for corporate clients who paid extraordinarily well to keep their names out of the news. I was good at it in a way that surprised even me, good at the particular patience it takes to sit with a spreadsheet for 11 hours until a number that shouldn't exist finally reveals itself. At 26, a fintech company called Larkspur Financial recruited me out to Seattle to build their risk and compliance division from scratch. A real title, a real salary, the kind of opportunity that doesn't repeat itself if you let it pass out of guilt. I said yes within a week. I have never fully explained to my family what that decision cost me. The apartment I lived in alone for 2 years because I couldn't afford both rent and flights home. The relationships I let wither because 80-hour weeks don't leave much room for dating. The specific loneliness of spending my first Christmas in Seattle eating takeout pho in sweatpants while my phone filled up with photos of everyone else's tree. I have also never fully explained what it gave me. The first year I made 6 figures and cried alone in my car in a Trader Joe's parking lot because I couldn't believe a girl from Larkin Street had gotten there. Every time I tried to explain either half of it to my family, the conversation became about my absence instead of my reasons. So eventually I stopped trying and let the silence do the explaining instead. Paige never framed my leaving as ambition. She framed it as desertion. And over the years, that framing hardened into a kind of family folklore that nobody bothered to fact check. I was the one who got out. She was the one who stayed and sacrificed. It didn't matter that I flew home for every holiday I could manage, arriving Wednesday night and leaving Sunday morning to make my Monday meetings, or that I'd quietly paid for my mother's cataract surgery 2 years earlier, $4,200 wired directly to the surgical center in Mansfield with no note attached. I remember that Thanksgiving specifically, because it was the same week the surgery happened, though nobody at that table knew it. I stood at the kitchen counter helping mom mash potatoes, still wearing sunglasses in the house because my flight had landed at 6 that morning, while Paige moved through the living room refilling drinks and telling our Aunt Linda and our Aunt Sue how hard it was, being the only one who actually showed up for this family anymore, how tired she was of carrying everyone. Aunt Linda had clucked sympathetically and said what a good daughter Paige was. Nobody asked why my mother could suddenly read her own recipe cards without squinting for the first time in 3 years. I let her have that story because correcting it felt like keeping score, and I didn't want to be a person who kept score with her own sister. I understand now that not keeping score isn't the same thing as not counting. I counted every time. I just never said the numbers out loud. There was one incident, years before any of this, that I didn't understand the weight of until much later. I was 19, home from college for winter break, poking around my father's workshop in the garage looking for a staple gun to hang string lights on the porch. I found a locked metal file box shoved behind a shelf of paint cans, the word Kesler written across the lid in faded marker, with the words "do not open" beneath it in a different, angrier hand, like it had been added later, in a hurry. I shook it once. Something inside shifted. Paper, not tools. I asked my father about it at dinner that night, half joking, holding my fork up like a microphone, asking if he was hiding a body out there in the garage. He didn't laugh. He set his own fork down hard enough that it rattled the plate against the table, and told me, in a voice I had never heard him use with me before or since, flat and low and final, to never go through his things again. That's not yours to look through, Emma. Not now, not ever. My Uncle Roy, who was over for dinner that night, changed the subject so fast it gave me whiplash, asking my mother something about a casserole recipe with an urgency that made no sense for a casserole recipe, his hand landing a little too heavily on my father's shoulder as he did it. My mother's eyes had gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere past the ceiling. I never asked about the box again. I filed the moment away the way you file away anything that scares you a little, and I didn't think about it again for 15 years. Every year, on the Sunday closest to my father's birthday, our whole family used to drive out to the reservoir past Mansfield for a cookout, folding chairs and a cheap grill, and my father telling the same 3 fishing stories he told every single year. And even after I moved to Seattle, I flew back for it more years than not, because some habits outlast the reasons you started them. The last time all 4 of us went together, 2 years before the retirement party, Paige spent most of the afternoon on her phone arguing with Todd about something I never learned the details of, and my father caught my eye across the picnic table with a look that said, without either of us saying anything, that he noticed too. That was the relationship as it stood the night of my father's retirement party. Close in the way old scar tissue is close to the original wound, tender if you pressed on it wrong, functional if nobody did. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I flew back to Seattle 3 days after the party without speaking to Paige again. I assumed, with the particular naivety of someone who has just watched their father cry in front of 70 people, that the truth had settled something. I was wrong within the week. Step 1 of what came next started small enough that I almost mistook it for grief. Paige called my cell 4 times in a row on a Tuesday night, 7 months to the day after the party. When I didn't pick up, she texted. A wall of messages that arrived faster than I could read them, some in full sentences, some half-typed and sent before she finished the thought. Todd had filed for divorce that morning. She needed $40,000 for a retainer to fight him for custody of Ivy and Sam, and she needed it by Friday, because the attorney she wanted, a woman named Cheryl Whitaker, who'd apparently handled a cousin's divorce well, wouldn't take the case without it up front. She needed our parents to take a loan against the house because apparently, in her mind, the house was still collateral to be spent, regardless of what it had nearly cost to save it the first time. This is an emergency, Emma. One text read, no punctuation, no capitalization, the kind of message that arrives when someone has stopped editing themselves for how it will read later. My father called me the next morning before I'd even had coffee, his voice tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. He'd already told Paige no himself, gently but firmly, before I ever weighed in. The house wasn't his to leverage anymore. It sat inside a trust I controlled, a structural safeguard Nolan Ashford, my attorney, had insisted on when we restructured the debt, precisely so this kind of pressure could never happen again, so that no future crisis, real or manufactured, could put the house back on the table. I told her she'd have to ask you, he said, sounding almost apologetic about it, like he'd handed me a problem he should have absorbed himself. She called my office line at 11 that morning, sobbing so hard my assistant, a 24-year-old named Priya, who had never met a single member of my family, came to my desk white-faced, asking if there'd been a death. I took the call in a conference room with the blinds down. I need $40,000, Emma. I need it by Friday. I don't have anyone else. I told her I'd think about it and get back to her within a day. That wasn't a real answer, and we both knew it. I let the second call go to voicemail. I blocked her number that same night, not out of cruelty, but because I recognized the shape of what was happening in real time, the same shape I'd watched from a distance for a decade. She had spent 5 years building a narrative where I was the villain and she was the martyr, and now that the narrative had been publicly disproven in front of 70 witnesses, she needed a new use for me. I wasn't going to fund it blind. My mother called the next evening, her voice pitched low, careful, the voice she used when she was trying to talk both of us off separate ledges at once. I could hear the television on behind her, the specific hum of the local news, and I pictured her standing in the kitchen doorway on Larkin Street with the cordless phone pressed to her ear, the way she always did, like the cord still mattered even though the house had gone cordless a decade ago. She's your sister, she said. Todd is fighting for full custody. She has nothing left, Emma. She humiliated me in front of 70 people to make herself look like a saint, I told her, and I kept my voice level, because I had learned a long time ago that raising it only gave Paige's version of events more ammunition to work with later. I'm not paying to keep playing the villain in her story, Mom. Not again. This isn't about the party. It's always about the party, I said. It's about every party before it too. I'm tired of being the ATM she pretends I am, so she doesn't have to admit she needs help. My mother was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I thought the call had ended. I just don't want to lose either of you, she finally said, and that more than anything Paige had said was the sentence that actually landed. My mother had spent her whole life trying to keep the peace between us by absorbing the cost of it herself, and I was tired in a different way, hearing that. I offered a compromise instead, the kind of reasonable middle ground I always seemed to be the one proposing. I wouldn't hand Paige cash. I would pay Ivy's dance tuition and Sam's speech therapy directly to the providers, $340 a month between the two of them. No funds ever touching Paige's hands. No way for the money to become collateral in whatever she and Todd were fighting over. My mother thanked me, relief audible even through the phone line. Paige, when she found out 2 days later, called it an insult, proof that I still didn't trust her with money, as if the distrust hadn't been earned across a decade of watching money vanish into arguments that were never really about money at all. 3 weeks later, my cousin Denise called me from her mother's kitchen table, her voice careful in a way that told me something had already gone wrong before she said a word. There had been a bridal shower for our cousin Katie at the VFW Hall in Harrow Falls, folding tables draped in pastel plastic, a mimosa bar someone had set up on a card table by the coat check. Paige had used the the open mic moment during gift opening, the same microphone instinct that had led her to a podium once before, to tell the assembled aunts and second cousins that I'd abandoned the family for a decade and was now trying to control what was left of it with money instead of love. She'd framed it as advice for the bride, a toast about how real family shows up in person, how money can't replace a body in a room, and half the table had nodded along, dabbing their eyes like she'd said something profound instead of something aimed. Denise said nobody there had heard about the wire transfer, or the foreclosure, or the 19 months I'd spent quietly keeping our parents in their home. Paige had simply never told that part, not once, in any of the family gatherings that had happened since. The retirement party reveal had happened in a banquet hall in front of 70 people, but 70 people out of an extended family that numbered closer to 200, spread across 3 counties, half of whom only heard secondhand versions filtered through whoever told the story last. There was no transcript to correct the record with. The story that traveled fastest was the one that had been repeated the longest, and Paige had a 14-year head start on the truth. I should have said something, Denise told me. I just froze. Aunt Linda was crying, Emma. She thinks you're the one who broke this family. I let it go, at the times. I told myself extended family gossip wasn't worth the energy of correction, that the people who actually mattered already knew the truth, and that trying to manage Paige's narrative in every room she entered across 3 counties would turn me into exactly the kind of person she already accused me of being, someone who needed an audience to keep score for her. 2 weeks after that, Paige tried a different angle entirely. She stopped calling me and started working on my mother instead, showing up at the house 3 evenings in a row after her shifts at the dermatology office, sitting at the kitchen table until 9 or 10 at night, telling my mother that if she really loved her grandchildren, she'd quietly move a few $1,000s out of the joint checking account Mom shared with Dad, just enough to cover the first attorney invoice, before I even had to know about it. My mother told me about it herself, unprompted, her voice equal parts guilty and proud, the first time in longer than I could remember that she'd chosen not to be the family's designated peacemaker. I told her no, she said. I told her I wasn't going to lie to your father in his own kitchen, not for anybody, not even her. It was a small thing, 3 nights of a mother holding a line she'd spent 30 years avoiding, but I understood even then that it mattered more than the amount of money involved. Paige had spent her whole life learning exactly which door in this family swung open easiest under pressure, and for the first time, that door had stayed shut. Then Paige found the boxes. My mother mentioned it almost in passing during our next call, the way people mention things they don't yet understand the significance of, tucked between an update on Sam's speech therapy and a complaint about the price of gas. Paige had gone out to the storage unit on Route 42, a 10 by 15 cinder block bay my parents used for the overflow from Dad's workshop after they downsized the garage 2 summers back, looking for old tax documents. She'd told my mother she needed them for Cheryl Whitaker, her divorce attorney, who apparently thought there might be a case to be made that our parents, and by extension me, were sitting on more money than we'd disclosed, that the trust holding the house might be hiding assets a family court could consider marital property. She hadn't found tax documents. She'd found a locked metal box shoved into the back corner behind a stack of paint cans and an old shop vac, Kesler written across the lid in faded marker, the same box I'd found at 19 and never mentioned to another living soul in 15 years. She hadn't been able to open it, the lock old but still intact. She'd texted my mother a photo of the lid instead, asking what it was, why it said, "Do not open," whether it had something to do with Dad's old job. My mother, on the phone with me, described going quiet in a way she couldn't fully explain, some old instinct rising up before her conscious mind caught up to it, and that quiet, apparently, had been enough to make even Paige, self-absorbed as she'd become, stop pushing for an answer that afternoon. I didn't think much of it at the time. I filed it next to the memory of my father's face at the dinner table 15 years earlier, another strange, unexplained corner of a family that had plenty of them, and I moved on with my week, back-to-back compliance reviews eating most of my daylight hours, because 2 days later, the real escalation landed on my desk in a plain white envelope with a Mansfield return address. A certified letter arrived from a law firm in Mansfield representing Todd Callahan, hand-delivered to the front desk at Larkspur Financial, which meant half my floor watched a process server walk out of our lobby before I even opened it. It was a subpoena, formally requesting financial records related to Meadowbrook Holdings, the private company I'd used to purchase and discharge my father's debt. Paige, it turned out, had told Todd's attorney, a man named Gregory Bream, that I had significant hidden wealth tied up in shell entities connected to our parents, and that some of it might legally belong to her in the divorce as an undisclosed marital asset her husband was trying to hide from. It was a strange, backwards accusation, since none of the money in question had ever touched Todd or Paige's marriage at all, but it didn't matter that the claim made no legal sense on its face. It was enough, technically, to trigger discovery. I called Nolan Ashford that same afternoon, standing at the window of my office with the subpoena in one hand and the Seattle skyline gray and flat in front of me. He was calm in the way expensive attorneys are trained to be calm, unhurried syllables, no wasted words, but even he paused for a moment when he'd finished reading through the filing on his end. "This is going to pull your parents into a deposition, Emma," he told me. "Your father may have to describe on the record, under oath, exactly how close he came to losing the house, the loan, the scam, Mom, all of it, in front of a court reporter with Bream asking the questions. I sat down at my desk chair slowly. Do we have a choice? We could fight the scope of the subpoena, slow it down, might work, might not, and it'll cost your parents another 6 months of this hanging over them either way. I told him to comply fully instead. Let them see there was no hidden fortune. Let the record show exactly what had happened and exactly why, because I had nothing left to hide from anyone, family or court, and I was done letting Paige's assumptions dictate the shape of my decisions. By Thursday night, my phone lit up with my father's name, and his voice on the other end was smaller than I'd ever heard it, smaller even than it had been at the party. Paige had shown up at the house that evening unannounced, still in her scrubs from a shift at the dermatology office, screaming in the driveway that I'd destroyed her marriage by refusing to help, that if she lost custody of the kids it would be entirely my fault, that Emma gets to play hero from 3,000 miles away, and I'm the one who has to live here and clean up after it. My mother had locked herself in the bathroom, something she hadn't done since I was in middle school, and my parents had a fight loud enough to rattle the windows. My father had stood on the porch in his socks and watched his younger daughter drive away too fast, gravel spraying against the mailbox post he'd installed himself the summer I turned 12, the same post Paige used to lean her bike against every afternoon before dinner. I don't know how to fix this one, Emma, he said, and it was the first time in my life I'd heard my father admit that about anything. An hour after that call ended, my phone rang again. Uncle Roy, a name that almost never appeared on my screen outside of holidays. He wasn't angry this time, and that alone told me something had shifted. He sounded scared, in a way I had never once heard from him in 34 years of knowing him as a steady, unshakable man, the kind of man who'd talked my father through 2 layoffs and a heart scare without his voice ever climbing above a low-level register. Emma, he said, there's something buried in your father's old factory records, something from over 30 years ago. If the wrong people get their hands on it, it won't be Paige who destroys this family. I sat down hard at my kitchen table, rain sliding sideways down the window glass behind me, the lights of downtown Seattle smeared into long yellow streaks through the water. What kind of something, Roy? He hesitated so long I thought the call had dropped entirely. I could hear him breathing on the other end, could picture him standing in his own kitchen 2,000 miles away, phone pressed to his ear, deciding how much of 30 years to hand me all at once. I can't say it over the phone, he finally said. Just know your sister already suspects something. She's been asking around the old union hall, talking to men who worked the floor back when your father was still a young supervisor, men who remember more than they should say to a woman going through a messy divorce looking for leverage. If she finds it before we can get ahead of it, she'll use it to win whatever fight she thinks she's in, and she won't understand what she's actually holding when she does. Neither will you yet, but you will. My phone buzzed against my ear before I could ask another question. A new message lighting the screen, even as Roy was still talking in my other ear. Paige. I stared at her name for a long moment after I hung up with Roy, my stomach folding in on itself, my thumb hovering over the message I was suddenly, genuinely afraid to open. I sat like that at my kitchen table for almost a full minute, rain still ticking against the glass, before I made myself tap the screen. When I finally opened it, there was no threat waiting for me, no ultimatum, none of the weaponized language I'd braced for. There was a photograph, slightly blurred, taken with a hand that looked like it had been shaking when it took the picture. A single sheet of paper, yellowed at the corners, official letterhead from Kesler Steel Works dated March of 1994, some of the type faded past legibility. Beneath the photo, Paige had written only, "Is this why Dad's been weird about that storage unit my whole life? I got the lock off with bolt cutters. What is this, Emma? I'm scared and I don't know who else to ask." It was, I would realize later, the first fully honest thing my sister had said to me in over a year. No performance in it anywhere. I called Roy back immediately, and this time he didn't hesitate, didn't ask me to wait, didn't try to soften the run-up the way he had 10 minutes earlier. He told me the story in pieces, the way people tell you things they've spent 30 years trying not to say out loud, his voice occasionally dropping so low I had to press the phone hard against my ear to catch it. In March of 1994, my father was 29 years old, 6 years into the job, recently promoted to line supervisor on the overnight shift, a promotion he'd been proud enough of to take my mother out to the one nice steakhouse in Mansfield to celebrate. Kesler Steel had a rush order from a client called Continental Rail, a contract worth enough to keep the plant running through a downturn that had already closed 2 competing mills in the county, the kind of contract men on the floor talked about like a lifeline because in a very real sense it was one. To hit the delivery window, the overhead crane on line 4 had been running double shifts with minimal downtime for inspection. A hoist cable on that crane had already been flagged twice in the maintenance logs as showing early signs of fraying, hairline strands visible near the drum where the cable wound tightest. Both times, the repair had been deferred to keep the line moving, signed off by a maintenance supervisor who answered to men above him who answered, in turn, to a production quota nobody wanted to miss. On the night of March the 14th, the cable failed while lifting a load of coiled steel above the floor. Dale Pruitt, 31 years old, Roy's closest friend since the two of them were boys fishing off the same dock on Miller's Pond, was working directly beneath it, guiding the load by hand signal the way the men had done 1,000 times before without incident. He died before the ambulance made it out of the parking lot. Roy, according to what he finally told me that night, was 40 feet away when it happened, close enough to hear the cable go, a sound he described to me only once once, briefly, and never again. Plant management. A man named Walt Corbett, who ran daily operations for the Kesler family that still owned the mill at the time, called my father into his office 2 days after the funeral. Roy said my father came home that night and didn't speak through dinner. Corbett needed the incident report to show the equipment as compliant, or risk an OSHA shutdown that would have cost the entire plant, and every job attached to it, including my father's and Roy's, in a town that had already watched 2 mills close inside 5 years. Frank, Corbett had reportedly told him, sliding the report across the desk. You sign this, the mill stays open, 300 men keep their jobs, and nothing changes for anybody except on paper. You don't sign it, I find someone who will, and you're out of a job for nothing. Corbett pressured my father, the supervisor of record on shift that night, to sign off on an inspection report stating the crane had passed its most recent safety check within regulation. It was a lie. My father knew it was a lie when he picked up the pen. He was 29 years old, with a wife and a 2-year-old daughter at home, Paige, and a mortgage he'd just taken out on the house on Larkin Street 3 months earlier. Dale Pruitt's widow, a woman named Sharon, who worked at the Harrow Falls Library for the next 20 years, without ever once mentioning the settlement to anyone, received a quiet payout from Kesler ownership months later, along with a non-disclosure agreement that kept the true cause of the accident out of any public record, out of the newspaper, out of the union's own internal review. My father received something too, though he never once, in 32 years, called it what it was in front of another living soul. A loyalty bonus, $22,000, paid out quietly the same year in 2 installments, the exact amount that had covered the down payment shortfall on the house I grew up in, the house on Larkin Street with the crooked mailbox post and the coffee can labeled vacation. He had spent 31 years afterward walking past the spot on line 4 where Dale Pruitt died every single overnight shift, carrying the specific private shame of a man who understood exactly what his silence had purchased and exactly what it had cost someone else to purchase it. The Kesler box held the original inspection report, the one he'd been asked to falsify, kept as some kind of penance or proof or both, alongside a handful of letters he'd started writing to Sharon Pruitt over the years, and never sent, according to Roy, who'd found 2 of them himself once, while helping my father move boxes after my grandfather's funeral, and never told a soul, not even my mother. That was the box in the garage. That was the reason he'd snapped at 19-year-old me for touching it, the only time in my life I ever heard that particular register in his voice. That was why he stared at his shoes at his own retirement party instead of looking at the room applauding him, a man who had spent 3 decades quietly believing he did not entirely deserve the family and the house and the life he'd built on top of a lie, right up until the daughter he thought he'd failed to raise close enough put $315,000 into his account and asked for nothing in return. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time after I hung up with Roy, the rain finally easing outside, my coffee gone cold beside my laptop. I thought about every dinner at that house where my father had gone quiet mid-conversation for no reason I could name. I thought about the year he'd refused, flatly, to let anyone plant flowers near the old Kesler Memorial Garden downtown, a small patch of city land with a plaque listing 3 names of workers who died on the job over the decades. Dale Pruitt's among them. A plaque I'd walked past 100 times as a kid, without once understanding why my father crossed the street to avoid that block. I thought about how much of what I'd always read as reserve, as quietness, as a kind of emotional distance I'd resented a little growing up, had actually been a man rationing himself so carefully around a wound none of us were allowed to see. I understood, sitting in my kitchen with rain still streaking the window and my phone still warm against my ear from 2 back-to-back calls, that I was no longer managing a family feud over money and a bad toast. I was managing a live wire that could take out far more than a sibling relationship if it was handled wrong, one that reached into a dead man's family and a decades-old cover-up neither Paige nor I had asked to inherit. I flew home 2 days later, booking the first flight out of SeaTac I could find, a red-eye that landed me in Mansfield at 6 in the morning with no sleep and too much coffee already in my system. Nolan came with me, not as my attorney in any official capacity for what was about to happen in that living room, but because I needed someone in the room who could speak plainly about legal exposure without emotion clouding the facts, someone whose calm wouldn't be mistaken for taking sides. I asked my mother to gather everyone at the house on Larkin Street on a Saturday afternoon. No explanation given over the phone beyond the words "we need to talk." All of us, together. Paige, Todd, still technically her husband, still technically the kid's father, still owed a version of the truth even mid-divorce, even mid-custody fight. Roy, my parents. I remember standing in the driveway before anyone else arrived, looking at that crooked mailbox post, thinking about how many versions of this family had lived inside that house without ever fully knowing each other. Paige arrived last, defensive, arms crossed before she'd even taken her coat off, parking crooked at the curb the way she used to when we were teenagers, clearly expecting another round of the fight we'd been having for weeks over the phone, and through my mother, as go-between. I didn't give her one. "I'm not here to talk about the money you asked for," I told her, standing in the same living room where I'd once watched cartoons on the floor beside her. "I'm here because you're about to blow open something you don't understand, and it's going to hurt people who don't deserve it. Dale Pruitt has a daughter. Her name is Renee. She's 38 years old. She's a nurse, and she has spent her whole life believing her father died in an accident nobody could have prevented. If you take what's in that box to Todd's lawyer, or to a reporter, or to anyone, to win a divorce, that's the story story you'll be rewriting for her, too. Paige's face went through several expressions in quick succession: confusion, defensiveness, and finally, something closer to shame, though shame had never been a comfortable emotion for her to sit in for long. I didn't know what it was, she said, her arms still crossed but looser now. I just found it. I wasn't going to do anything with it. You cut a lock off a box marked "Do Not Open" and photographed the contents, I said, not unkindly, just factually, the way I'd learned to lay out evidence in a boardroom. That's already doing something with it, Paige. You just didn't know what door you were opening yet. You already told 2 men at the Union Hall you thought Dad was hiding something, Roy said quietly from his chair by the window, his hands folded tight in his lap. It was the first time I'd heard him speak to Paige directly in weeks, maybe months. Frank Jr. and Bobby Alvarez both called me the same night, asking if there was trouble. That's not nothing, Paige. That's a fuse, and you lit it without knowing there was a building attached to the other end. My father flinched at the sound of those names. Men he'd worked beside for 3 decades. Men who had no idea what they'd nearly been asked to remember. So what? Everyone just gets to keep secrets except me, Paige said. And there it was. The pivot I'd watched her make my entire life. The reflex that turned every conversation back to her own grievance, no matter what had just been placed in front of her. You knew about this? You've known, and you let me almost dig it up and expose Dad myself, without a single warning? This isn't about who gets to keep secrets, I said, keeping my voice even as something in my chest wanted to raise it. It's about what you do with one the second it lands in your hands. I found out 4 days ago, I said, the same way you did, by accident. The difference is I called Roy before I called a lawyer, and you told 2 men at a Union Hall before you told your own mother. My mother made a small sound from the couch, not quite a sob, and reached for my father's hand. He let her take it. For the first time in longer than I could remember, he lifted his head and looked directly at Paige instead of at the floor. I've carried this for 32 years, he said. I've carried it through every birthday, every graduation, every Sunday dinner in this house. I don't need you to carry it too. I need you to leave it where it is, and let me decide, with your uncle, what happens to it from here. Paige didn't apologize, not fully, not in the way I'd hoped, but something in her posture changed, the fight draining out of her shoulders as the reality of what she was standing next to finally settled in. I just wanted someone to see how hard this year has been for me, she said, quieter now. And for the first time in the conversation, it sounded less like a performance and more like the truth underneath one. I know, I said, and I meant it, because that was the thing about Paige that had always been hardest to hold alongside my anger at her. Her need to be seen wasn't fake. It was just aimed in a direction that kept costing other people. But you don't get to be seen by burning down a dead man's memory to do it. That's the line, Paige. I'm not the villain in your story anymore. I'm done auditioning for that role. Todd, who had said almost nothing the entire afternoon, finally spoke from the doorway where he'd been standing, arms crossed, coat still on. This is why I'm fighting for the kids, he said quietly. Not cruelly, just plainly. Not because you're a bad mother, Paige, because you'll burn anything down when you're cornered, and I don't want Ivy and Sam standing that close to the fire. Nobody defended her. Not my mother, who had spent 34 years defending her by reflex, who usually had some soft landing ready before Paige even finished falling. Not Roy. The silence in that living room said more than any of us could have, stretching on long enough that I heard the refrigerator cycle on in the kitchen, the specific hum of a house I'd grown up in, holding its breath along with the people inside it. Paige looked around the room once, slowly, like she was taking attendance on who was and wasn't in her corner, and something in her face settled into an expression I hadn't seen on her since we were kids. The look she used to get right before she'd admit, quietly, that she'd been the one who broke something and not me. She didn't say it out loud that afternoon, but I recognized the shape of it forming, even if it would take her months to actually say the words. The weeks that followed moved faster than I expected, the way things do once a family finally stops pretending a problem is smaller than it is. Everyone in that living room walked out changed by different amounts, and it took most of the fall for the changes to finish settling. Denise called me first less than a week later, apologizing for the bridal shower comments she'd let slide without correction, her voice thick with the specific guilt of someone who'd had months to say something and hadn't. She told me she'd since told the rest of that side of the family the real story, wire transfer and all, sitting her own mother down at that same kitchen table and walking her through it slowly, the way you'd explain something to someone who badly wanted to keep believing the easier version. A handful of cousins I hadn't heard from in years sent short, awkward texts over the following weeks, the kind people send when they're embarrassed about having believed a story without ever asking for the other side of it. Aunt Linda called and cried on the phone for 10 minutes, apologizing for the toast comment, for every nod of agreement at that VFW hall, for not once in 14 years asking me directly what my side of any of it actually was. The split wasn't clean, and it wasn't total either. My mother's side of the family largely came around once Denise started correcting the record, but my father's side, smaller, closer to the mill and the Union Hall and the particular loyalty that comes from 30 years of shared shift work, mostly just went quiet on the subject entirely, unwilling to weigh in on anything that touched Kesler Steel even at a distance they didn't fully understand. Todd's mother, who had grown fond of me over a decade of holidays, sent me a long, careful email that autumn saying she was sorry for how the whole thing had unfolded and that she hoped I knew not everyone in that family had ever believed Paige's version of events, even when they'd stayed quiet at the party. It wasn't a redemption arc. It was smaller than that, quieter, quieter, a handful of relationships getting recalibrated one honest conversation at a time. No dramatic reversal, just people slowly updating a picture they'd let go stale. I found I didn't need the whole extended family to see me clearly. I just needed the handful who mattered to finally stop looking away. Paige, for her part, made one last desperate move before the custody proceedings concluded, about 3 weeks after the living room conversation, once the initial shame had worn off and the old instincts crept back in. She reached out to a reporter at the Mansfield paper, a younger man named Colin Reyes, who covered local government and the occasional feature, hinting at a decades-old cover-up at Kesler Steel works, hoping the pressure of a public story might give her leverage in the divorce, might force Todd's attorney to back off the custody fight, might, I think, in some wounded corner of her mind, finally make someone in that family feel as exposed as she'd felt her whole life standing in my shadow. The reporter, to his credit, wanted documentation, corroboration, a source willing to go on record, none of which Paige could actually produce without incriminating our father further, without doing the exact damage I'd asked her not to do in that living room 3 weeks earlier. The story never ran. But word of the attempt got back to Todd's attorney through a mutual acquaintance at the paper, the way small-town information always finds its way back around, and it did exactly the opposite of what Paige had hoped. It became evidence in the custody filing, Exhibit F, an example of erratic, retaliatory behavior a family court judge could weigh against her, proof, in the court's eyes, of someone willing to burn a decades-old family secret for leverage in a fight over 2 kids. Todd was granted primary custody of Ivy and Sam that autumn, with standard visitation for Paige every other weekend, contingent on a parenting evaluation she'd have to complete before any modification could be considered down the line. My mother cried for 2 days when she heard, not because she believed Paige was a dangerous mother. She wasn't, not by any real measure, but because she understood, maybe for the first time fully, how much of this outcome Paige had built with her own hands, one desperate move at a time, each one aimed at winning something that was never actually up for grabs the way she thought it was. Todd, oddly enough, became something like an ally through all of it. Not to me directly, we spoke maybe twice more that whole year, but to the truth of what had actually happened. When his own attorney tried, early on, to paint me as a hostile witness withholding assets, Todd was the one who pushed back, telling Bream plainly that he'd sat in that living room and watched me try to protect his soon-to-be ex-wife from a mistake bigger than either of them, and that using it against the family further felt like punching down at people who'd already been generous. It didn't repair his marriage. It didn't need to. But it meant the custody fight, brutal as it was, never fully curdled into the kind of scorched earth war that drags children through years of depositions, and I found myself grateful to a man I barely knew for drawing that line where Paige couldn't. There were smaller complications too, the unglamorous kind nobody warns you about. Paige and Todd's marital home, a modest 3-bedroom on the edge of town they'd bought together at 25, had to be appraised, listed, and sold that winter to settle the divorce, a 6-week process that left Paige bouncing between our parents' guest room and a rented duplex on the other side of Harrow Falls while she waited for her half of the proceeds to clear escrow. She lost $1,100 to a moving company that damaged half her furniture in transit and refused to honor the insurance claim, a small injustice that would have once sent her straight to my phone demanding I fix it. This time she handled it herself, filing a complaint with the State Attorney General's Consumer Division and eventually recovering most of the loss, a detail my mother relayed to me with a strange, careful pride, like she wasn't sure she was allowed to be proud of Paige for something that ordinary yet. Roy, for his part, started showing up differently too, calling me directly instead of routing everything through my father, asking about my work in Seattle with what sounded like genuine curiosity instead of polite obligation. He told me once, almost offhand, that he'd spent 32 years being the only person besides my father who carried the weight of March 1994, and that having someone else finally know, even at the cost of nearly losing control of the secret entirely, had lifted something in him he hadn't realized was still pressing down. The subpoena against Meadowbrook Holdings resolved quietly that November. Nolan produced the full record, every transaction, every dollar accounted for, 3 binders worth of documentation delivered to Gregory Bream's office in Mansfield, and the court found nothing resembling a hidden marital asset because there was nothing there to find. My parents were spared the deposition Nolan had originally warned me about, a small mercy in a season that hadn't offered many, and I remember calling my father the day we got word, hearing him exhale for what felt like the first time in weeks. Roy and my father spent 2 long evenings at the kitchen table on Larkin Street after that, coffee going cold between them, deciding what, if anything, to do about Dale Pruitt's daughter. There was no clean answer available to them, and I wasn't in the room for those conversations, only heard about them afterward in pieces. The statute of limitations had long since closed any legal exposure either of them might have faced, and going public risked reopening a wound for a family that had spent 3 decades believing a settled, gentler version of the truth, a widow's version, a version where a good man simply died in a terrible accident nobody could have stopped. In the end, they chose something smaller and quieter than confession. Roy had stayed loosely in touch with Renee Pruitt Hale over the years, the way people in small towns often do without ever quite meaning to, running into her at the pharmacy counter or the 4th of July parade, exchanging the kind of pleasantries that never dig deeper than the weather. Through those small exchanges, he'd learned she was a nurse now at the the regional hospital in Mansfield, that she'd gone back to school later in life to finish the degree after raising 2 kids of her own, mostly alone on a hospital tech's salary, and that she was still, at 38, paying down the loans that degree had cost her. My father asked me one evening, hesitantly, almost unable to get the words out fully, sitting across from me at that same kitchen table, whether Meadowbrook Holdings, the structure I'd built to save his house, could make one more transfer, anonymous, untraceable, back to any of us. I said yes before he finished the sentence. $11,000 went to her loan servicer 2 weeks later, routed through the same shell that had once saved his own house, this time in the name of a man who never got to grow old enough to need saving himself. I never met Renee Pruitt-Hale. I only know, secondhand from Roy, that she called the loan servicer confused about the payment, was told only that it had come from a private benefactor who wished to remain anonymous, and that she'd cried on the phone with the customer service representative, thanking someone she would never be able to identify. I think about that phone call more than almost anything else from that entire year. A woman thanking a stranger for a kindness her father's death had, in some roundabout and unspoken way, actually paid for 32 years earlier. It didn't undo anything. My father told me that himself, sitting on the porch one evening in October, 2 mugs of coffee going cold on the railing between us, watching the streetlight on Larkin Street flicker on for the first time that fall, the way it had every autumn evening of my childhood. It doesn't make it right, he said. I know that. $11,000 doesn't buy back a man's life, and it sure doesn't buy back 32 years of me walking past that spot on the floor every night like nothing happened there. I just needed to do something that wasn't only for me, for once, something that didn't have my own name attached to the good it did. I sat with him a long time that evening, not saying much, watching the same street I'd grown up on go dark block by block, porch lights clicking on one by one down the row of houses I could have named the owners of blindfolded. I thought about the version of him I'd spent my whole life seeing, steady, quiet, a man who fixed things without being asked and never raised his voice except once, over a locked box in a garage I'd had no business opening. I understood him differently now, not as someone who had failed, but as someone who had made an impossible choice at 29 years old, a mortgage and a 2-year-old and no good options in front of him, and had spent every year since trying quietly to be worth the cost of it. There was grief in that understanding, a real one, sitting heavier in my chest than I expected. Grief for the father who might have existed if he'd never had to carry that weight at all, lighter somehow, freer with his own children in a way I only half remembered from the earliest years. Grief for the sister I might still have, close the way we were at 7 and 10, if either of us had learned to ask for help before we learned to perform strength instead. My father reached over at some point and squeezed my hand, once, the same way he used to when I was small and scared of thunder, and neither of us said anything else for a long while. It's been almost a year since the retirement party. My father is fully retired now, spending his mornings restoring an old John boat in the garage where that metal box used to sit, sanding the hull down by hand instead of paying someone to do it faster, because he says he likes having somewhere to put his hands these days. The box itself is gone now, its contents finally, quietly laid to rest with Roy's blessing, burned in a coffee can behind the garage on a night neither of them has ever fully described to me. My mother still works part-time at the elementary school, unwilling to give up her granola bar drawer for anyone, though she started leaving a little early on Fridays to meet my father for lunch at the diner downtown, something they never used to do when every spare hour went toward keeping the house afloat. The house on Larkin Street is paid off completely now, deed clear, no trust required to protect it anymore, because there's nothing left threatening to take it. My father repainted the mailbox post last spring, the same one Paige's gravel had sprayed across, sanded it down, and painted it the same navy blue it had always been, like he needed to put that back the way it was too. I fly home more now than I used to, 4 or 5 times a year instead of 2, and Seattle has started to feel less like an escape from Harrow Falls, and more like simply where I live, which is its own kind of peace I didn't expect to find. My work at Larkspur is going well. I made director of the whole risk division last spring, a promotion that used to be the only kind of homecoming I knew how to imagine for myself. Paige and I are not close, not in the way we were as girls braiding each other's hair before school, sharing a room during thunderstorms, teaching each other to ride bikes in an empty church parking lot on Sundays. I don't know if we'll ever get back to that, or if that version of us was always going to be something childhood alone could hold. We talk sometimes now, careful, shorter conversations than we used to have, mostly about the kids, who I see every few months when I fly home, Ivy taller every time, Sam finally growing out of his stutter with the speech therapy I'd quietly paid for. Paige sent me a card on my birthday this year, no occasion prompting it, the first unprompted kind thing she'd done in longer than I could remember. It said only, "Thank you for not letting me destroy everything," in her handwriting, no further explanation attached, and I understood exactly what she meant without needing one. I keep it in the drawer of my desk in Seattle, not because it fixes anything, but because it's proof that some part of her, underneath all the performance, saw the truth clearly enough to write it down. I used to think proving my love for this family had to be loud to count, a toast, a public reckoning, a moment where everyone finally saw what I'd done and said so out loud in a room full of witnesses. I know better now. The realest thing I ever did for my family happened at 2 in the morning, 19 months before anyone clapped for it, wired quietly from an account with my name on it into an account that would have otherwise disappeared into foreclosure, and it would have meant exactly the same thing if no one had ever never found out at all. That's the part Paige never understood. The night she called me a selfish traitor at that podium, microphone shaking in her hand, 70 people laughing along with her. Loyalty that needs an audience isn't loyalty. It's just another performance dressed up to look like sacrifice, and I'd spent my whole life quietly refusing to give one. Something real was lost in all of it. A version of my sister I still miss on ordinary afternoons, folding laundry or driving past the exit for Harrow Falls on my way somewhere else. A version of my father who never had to carry 32 years of a stranger's death on his conscience just to keep a paycheck coming. I don't know if either of those people were ever fully real, or just the ones I wanted badly enough to believe in when I was young enough not to know better. But I've made my peace with the family I actually have instead of the one I used to imagine we were. Imperfect and quieter and harder won than it should have had to be. And most days, that peace is enough to stand on. Most days, it's more than enough.